And the last thing I want to talk about in terms of solving quadratic equations is when do you know to use each of the four methods? Okay, so you can take the square root, you can factor, you can complete the square, or you can use quadratic formula. But if they don't tell you which method to use, how do you know which one to use? Like, how do you know which one's going to be the easiest? So let's start by talking about taking the square root, okay? Because this one is the most limited. You can only use this method when you don't have a bx or middle term. So basically when you only have a quantity squared. So for example, 9x squared minus 7 equals 605. There's no regular x term here. So you just have an x squared. So you can solve this by taking the square root. Or for example, the x minus 5 squared plus 4. You just have a quantity squared, no regular x's that are not being squared. So you can solve this by taking the square root. If, for example, in this example, if you had a 9x squared minus 3x minus 7 equals 605, the fact that you have a quantity that's not being squared with the variable means that you cannot solve this by taking the square root. Okay, now let's talk about factoring. And basically, whenever you can factor, that's always going to be the fastest and easiest way to solve the quadratic. So yeah, whenever you can factor, do so. Okay, and the important thing to remember about that is you want to get 0 on one side of the equation first so that you can use the zero product property. But not every single quadratic equation is going to be factorable. So you can't use factoring all the time, but whenever you can, I recommend that you do use that. Now, completing the square, you can use this anytime, but I don't really prefer it because depending on the quadratic equation, it can be really messy and you might have to work with a lot of fractions. Like for example, if the b, that middle coefficient is odd, then you're going to end up adding a fraction on this side. And then when you factor it, it's also going to be a fraction. Okay, so you can use it, but I don't really recommend it all the time because if you're not super strong working with fractions, there are a lot of places to make mistakes there. So for the most part, I only use completing the square when they ask me to, right? If the problem specifically says to solve by completing the square, then I solve it by completing the square. If not, I generally don't, unless I notice that the leading coefficient, that a is 1, and the b is already even. And again, the reason I want b to be even is so that when you do half of b, it's still going to be a whole number. And then when you square it, it'll also be a whole number. So I don't have to work with fractions. And for quadratic formula, you can use this anytime. But the downside is that it's really long because you have that entire equation. X equals negative b plus or minus the square root b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And so the nice thing about that is that you can use this for any quadratic equation. So if you're the kind of person that doesn't like to, strategize, doesn't like to, you don't care about maybe saving time or whatever, you just want to, you always want to use the same strategy for every single problem, then yeah, you can use quadratic formula because it'll work for any quadratic equation. But the downside is that it can take a really long time to simplify all the different steps. And the important thing to remember about that as well is that you have to get 0 on one side of the equation first. So for these two, factoring and quadratic formula, you have to get 0 on one side of the equation before you can use those methods. But for taking square root and completing the square, you don't need 0 on one side of the equal sign. You just want to solve for x.